A white CEO at an elite investor summit looks a black man up and down and refuses to shake his hand. In front of 30 people, he tells him he looks like he wandered in from the kitchen. The room laughs. The black man says nothing. He just nods once and walks away. That night, the CEO gets an email that changes everything. The man he humiliated controls $2.3 billion, and he's the only investor on Earth who can save the CEO's company from collapse in 90 days. But here's what the CEO doesn't know. That handshake he refused? It was the least of what he lost. Before we get into this one, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were dealing with? I want to hear your story. Now, let's begin. The Charlotte Marriott Grand knew how to dress for money. Chandeliers hung 3 stories above the lobby, like frozen waterfalls, and the carpet was the kind of deep burgundy that swallowed the sound of footsteps, so that powerful people could move through a room without announcing themselves. The Pinnacle Ventures Capital Summit had been running for 11 years. Every year, it smelled the same: champagne, designer cologne, and the particular tension of people performing their own importance for each other. Marcus Tate stepped out of a rental sedan at 6:47 p.m., alone. No driver. No assistant trailing behind him with the phone to his ear. He wore a navy suit that fit him well and told you nothing else. In his left hand, he carried a leather portfolio, its corners worn soft as a handshake, the leather darkened in the places where fingers had gripped it for 30 years. He moved through the lobby the way his father had taught him to move through rooms, without urgency, without performance. He observed. He noted the name badges with company valuations printed in small font beneath the titles, a detail so brazen it almost made him smile. He accepted a glass of club soda from a passing server, nodded his thanks, and began making his way around the reception floor. The Lakebridge Dynamics booth was easy to find. The crowd around it was the thickest in the room. Grant Hollister stood at its center, like a man who'd been born standing at centers of rooms. He was tan even in March, silver-haired, square-jawed. His suit was the kind that came with its own mythology. He was mid-story when Marcus arrived at the edge of the group. Something about a golf weekend and a senator, and the people around him were laughing in the way that people laugh when they're more interested in being noticed laughing than in the joke itself. Marcus waited for a natural pause. Then he stepped forward, extended his hand, and said, "Grant Hollister, Marcus Tate. I've been looking at your logistics platform. I'd like to talk about what you're building." Grant Hollister looked at him, not the way you look at a person, the way you look at an object that has appeared somewhere unexpected. His eyes moved. Suit, portfolio, face, in the time it takes to draw a breath. Then he pulled his hand back. Not quickly, slowly, like a deliberate statement. "This reception," Grant said, loud enough for the circle to hear, "is for verified investors." He smiled. "Not caterers who wandered in from the kitchen." The laughter came fast, reflex laughter, the kind that fills a silence before the brain catches up to what it's agreeing with. A woman in the circle, Diane Pruitt, Lakebridge's CFO, let a small smile cross her face and looked away. A younger man standing just behind Grant's shoulder, barely 30, in an off-the-rack suit with a slightly crooked tie, looked down at his shoes. Marcus did not move. He held Grant Hollister's gaze for 3 full seconds. The smile on Grant's face flickered, just slightly, under the weight of a stare that refused to flinch. Then Marcus nodded once, a single, quiet nod, and he turned and walked away. No words, no raised voice, no scene. He found a space at the lobby bar, away from the noise. He set the leather portfolio on the counter beside his drink. Outside the tall windows, Charlotte glittered in the March dark, indifferent and bright. Marcus looked out at it and was quiet. Not humiliated, just quiet, measuring. He picked up his club soda and held it for a moment. 30 years ago, a man had handed him this portfolio and told him something about character that Marcus had never once forgotten. He thought about that man now. He set the glass back down. Whatever Grant Hollister thought had just happened, he was wrong about all of it. Grant Hollister poured 2 fingers of scotch and decided the evening had gone well. His suite was on the 14th floor, corner-facing, the skyline arranged outside the window like something he'd ordered. He'd loosened his tie. His jacket was draped over the chair with the ease of a man who expected someone else to deal with it. He was running through a mental scorecard of the reception, who he'd worked, who he'd impressed, which conversations had gone somewhere useful, when Diane Pruitt knocked twice and let herself in. She had her laptop open before she sat down. "The summit sent the nightly briefing," she said. Her voice had a quality he recognized, carefully neutral, the way she sounded when she was about to tell him something he didn't want to hear. "New registrations, late arrivals." She turned the screen toward him. "Look at the 3rd name." He looked. He read it twice. "Marcus Tate." He shrugged. "Never heard of him." "I know." Diane pulled the laptop back and started typing. "Neither had I, so I looked him up." She pulled up the website first, then the SEC filings, then a Forbes profile, 3 years old, that ran nearly 2,000 words without a single photograph, because Marcus Tate was, by every account, a man who had never needed a photograph to be taken seriously. Tate Meridian Capital, $2.3 billion under management, 7 major tech exits in the Southeast in the last decade, including 2 that Grant could name off the top of his head because everyone in their industry could name them. The kind of firm that didn't advertise because its reputation moved faster than any ad could. Grant read the screen. The scotch sat untouched. "He's the one," Diane said. "The man from the reception." Grant's jaw tightened. "You're sure?" "Marcus Tate, managing director, checked in this afternoon. Single registration, no entourage." She paused. "Navy suit, leather portfolio." The silence in the suite was a different quality now. "He controls more capital," Diane continued, "than the next 5 investors at this summit combined. And Lake Bridge's $40 million round, the one we need closed in 90 days to cover the bridge financing, has no other realistic lead at this table." She closed the laptop. "Grant, he's not just an investor. He's the investor. And you told him he looked like the help." Grant stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the same city Marcus had looked at from the lobby bar, seeing something entirely different. "Set up a breakfast meeting," he said. "First thing tomorrow. Keep it professional." Diane said nothing. He sat at the desk, opened his email, began typing, formal, measured, a sentence that acknowledged the previous evening in the vaguest possible terms and proposed a meeting to discuss strategic alignment. He read it back, deleted the middle section, rewrote it, read it again. The words looked wrong. They sounded like what they were. A man who had never once in his life had to apologize to someone who owed him nothing, trying to figure out what that sentence was supposed to sound like. He stared at the screen. 90 days. No other leads. He hit send and told himself it would be fine, but the scotch had gone warm, and the suite felt smaller than it had an hour ago. And somewhere, 14 floors below, in a restaurant he couldn't see from this window, Marcus Tate was finishing a quiet dinner and, in all likelihood, not thinking about Grant Hollister at all. That, more than anything else, was the part that kept him awake. Grant had slept maybe 3 hours. He was at the summit's business center by 7:15, pressed and buttoned and performing a composure he didn't feel. He'd sent the meeting request through the summit's official concierge platform. Clean, professional, no reference to the night before. Just a name, a company, and a time slot. The kind of message that assumed the other party would, of course, say yes. Across the hotel, in the restaurant off the main lobby, Marcus Tate was eating breakfast. He had a plate of eggs and a cup of coffee, and in front of him were 3 folders, printed, tabbed, the kind of preparation that doesn't announce itself. He moved through them without urgency. Around him, the restaurant filled with summit attendees in various states of caffeinated ambition. Marcus noted them the way he noted everything, quietly, completely, without expression. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, read the message, set the phone face down, and went back to his eggs. A few minutes later, his phone rang. Yolanda Price, calling from Atlanta. "Morning," she said. "You've got 4 more requests this morning. Lakebridge Dynamics, Medbridge Solutions, Kudu Capital, and a company called Freightline, small logistics startup out of Raleigh, founder named Solene Harper. She's here at the summit." "Accept Medbridge, Kudu, and Freightline," Marcus said. "Decline Lakebridge." A pause. "1 line or a full reply?" "1 line." He drank his coffee. "Tell them, Mr." Hollister made his position clear. He could hear Yolanda's quiet satisfaction in the brief silence before she said, "Done." "And Yolanda, what did you pull on Freightline?" "Small but real. Founder bootstrapped it for 2 years, applied for 3 rounds of outside capital, got passed over each time. Product reviews from her first clients are strong. Margins are thin, but the model works." Another pause. "She's the real thing." He thanked her and set the phone on the table. The eggs were good. The coffee was better. Outside the restaurant window, the morning was gray and still. He thought about his father. It arrived the way it always did. Not summoned, just present. Earl Tate had driven trucks for 31 years, across roads that didn't care who you were, had come home from every run with the same steady quiet, and had said things to a teenage Marcus that only made full sense 20, 30 years later. One of them arrived now, clear as a voice in the room. You show a man a chance to respect you, and he turns away from it. That tells you everything you need, son. Don't spend another minute making it complicated. Marcus closed the 3rd folder and stacked all 3 neatly to one side. He'd told Yolanda the same thing in different words once, when she'd asked him why he never gave second chances to people who'd shown their character early. If a man shows you who he is at a cocktail party, he'd said, believe him before he needs your money. She'd written it down. He'd told her she didn't need to. She'd said she disagreed. In the business center, 2 floors up, Grant Hollister's phone lit up with a notification from the Summit Concierge platform. He opened it, read the 7 words. Mr. Hollister made his position clear. He read it again. His thumb hovered. There was no reply to send to something like that. No follow-up that wouldn't make it worse. He looked up. Diane was watching him from across the small table, and she didn't ask what it said because she could see it already in the way the color had left his face. "So that's a no?" she said. "That's a no." He set the phone on the table. Outside the business center window, the summit was already moving. Attendees crossing the lobby with lanyards swinging, conversations starting, money beginning its slow migration toward the people who knew how to hold it. Somewhere in that building, Marcus Tate was finishing his breakfast and moving on to the next thing. And Grant Hollister had already run out of easy options. Grant gave himself exactly 1 hour to feel sorry for himself. Then he got to work. He moved through the summit's morning programming like a man running a grid search, scanning faces, calculating relationships, looking for the angle he'd missed. Direct requests hadn't worked, so he would stop being direct. He found Catherine Wells at the coffee station outside the main conference hall. She was polished and pleasant, the kind of investor who collected goodwill the way other people collected frequent flyer miles. Grant pulled her aside and kept it brief. He'd had a misunderstanding with a colleague at the reception. He needed a soft introduction. Could she mention his name in passing if she crossed paths with Marcus Tate? Catherine's smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes did. She said she'd see what she could do. Doug Fenton was a different conversation entirely. He was heavyset and easy to spot, cowboy boots under a charcoal suit, a voice that arrived in a room before he did. Grant caught him in the hallway between sessions and laid out the same ask. Fenton listened with his arms crossed and his head tilted, the way a man listens when he's already decided on his answer and is just waiting for you to finish talking. "Grant," he said, "I heard what happened at that reception. Most of the floor heard what happened at that reception." He uncrossed his arms. "You made your bed in front of 30 people. I'm not climbing in it with you." He walked away without waiting for a reply. Grant stood in the hallway and watched him go. His jaw was tight. His thumb found the crown of his watch and turned it once, slowly. 2 floors up, Marcus was sitting across from Solène Harper in a small conference room near the East Wing, and the conversation felt nothing like a business meeting. Solène had a laptop open and a printed one-sheet, but she talked with her hands more than her slides, tracing delivery routes on an imaginary map, describing the warehouse floor she'd rented in Raleigh when the orders finally outpaced her apartment. She laughed when she described her first client calling to complain that the software was too fast because it had found a routing error their team had missed for 2 years. Marcus asked questions, real questions, not the kind designed to expose weakness, but the kind that showed he'd read the materials and wanted to understand how her mind worked. How she'd priced her first contract, what she'd gotten wrong in year 1, where the model broke down under pressure. Solène answered all of it without flinching. He was watching her the way his father used to watch a road before committing to it, reading for what wasn't marked on the map. An hour later, Grant found Diane in the hallway. "Catherine struck out," she said before he could ask. He thanked her and moved on. "And I heard about Fenton." Grant said nothing. He turned his watch on his wrist, once, twice. Charm hadn't worked. Friends hadn't worked. That left one option, and it was the most dangerous one, because it required Diane to walk into a room and be convincing, and Grant had never once stopped to consider whether Diane's loyalty had a cost. The hotel lounge was quiet at 8 o'clock. Low lighting, a piano recording no one was really listening to, a handful of guests spread out in armchairs like punctuation marks. Marcus had a glass of water and a book, and he had been perfectly still for 40 minutes when Diane Pruitt sat down across from him. She had changed into a blazer that read less corporate than her summit attire. She had practiced this in the elevator. "Mr. Tate," she said, "I hope I'm not interrupting." He looked up. He waited. She told him she wanted to speak on her own behalf, not for the company, not for anyone else. She said what happened at the reception had been troubling her since the moment it occurred. She said Grant's words had been taken out of context, that he could be blunt and that sometimes it landed wrong, that he was not that kind of man at his core. She said it all the way she'd rehearsed it, clean, measured, apologetic without being specific enough to constitute an admission. Marcus listened to every word. He didn't interrupt. He didn't shift in his chair. When she finished, there was a moment of quiet, and then he asked one question. "Did he send you?" Marcus said, "or did you come on your own?" Diane opened her mouth, and in the space between the question and her answer, something moved across her face. A flicker, half a second, gone almost before it arrived, but it had been there. She said, "I just felt it was the right thing to do." Marcus nodded slowly. "I appreciate the conversation," he said, and he returned to his book. Diane walked back to the elevator and rode up to the 14th floor and knocked on Grant's door. He opened it before she'd finished the second knock. "Well," he said, "it didn't work." Grant's face went through several things at once. "What do you mean it didn't work? You apologized. You explained." "He asked one question and I couldn't answer it cleanly," she said. He knew. Grant turned away from the door and walked back into the suite. His voice rose with each word. He's being completely unreasonable. I sent an apology. I sent you. What does he want? Does he want a ceremony? Does he want it on a billboard? Diane stood in the doorway and said nothing. This was the thing about Grant that she had understood for years and never once said out loud. He believed an apology was a form of payment. You tendered it, and the other party was obligated to clear the debt. The idea that Marcus simply didn't want anything from him, that no currency Grant possessed was relevant to this transaction, was so far outside his experience that he had filed it under the category of unreasonable rather than under the category of consequence. She watched him pace. Across the hotel, in room 614, Ryan Shelby sat on the edge of his bed with his laptop open. On the screen was a document he'd started 3 times and deleted twice. A resignation letter. His mother's medical debt was $22,000. He knew that number the way he knew his own birthday. He looked at the cursor blinking in the empty document, and he thought about the man's face at the reception. The 3-second stare, the single nod, the quiet walk away, and he wondered what it cost a person to carry that kind of dignity. He started typing again. By day 3, the story had a life of its own. It moved the way gossip moves through a closed conference, person to person, picked up and carried and set down again, each telling slightly more detail than the last. At the coffee station near the main hall, 2 investors from Raleigh spoke in low voices about what they'd heard, one of them shaking his head slowly, the other glancing over his shoulder as if checking whether the walls had ears. In an elevator heading up to the 3rd floor, a startup founder from Nashville heard the whole thing from a venture partner she'd met 12 hours ago, and she stepped off on her floor feeling a particular kind of sick she recognized from other rooms in other cities. A summit organizer named Patricia, who had worked this event for 6 years, quietly typed up a 2-paragraph incident summary and forwarded it to the host committee with a subject line that read, FYI, situation to monitor. By 10 that morning, 2 investors who had submitted preliminary letters of intent for Lake Bridge's funding round emailed the summit coordinator to withdraw. Both cited reputational concerns. Neither used Grant's name. They didn't have to. Grant was in the middle of a revised pitch rehearsal when Diane put her phone down on the table between them and said, Helen called. Helen Marsh, board chair. 61 years old, silver-haired, with a voice that didn't need volume because every person who'd ever heard it had learned to listen carefully the first time. Grant took the call in the hallway. Helen didn't ask what happened. She told him what she'd heard from a board member's wife at a charity lunch in Charlotte that morning, which meant the story had already jumped the wall from the summit into the city's social fabric. She told him she needed him to explain himself. Grant minimized. He deflected. He said the man had approached the booth without credentials, that in the moment he'd simply misread the situation, that the whole thing was being blown out of proportion by someone who clearly had an agenda. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't care what he was wearing. You insulted a man worth 50 times your valuation in front of witnesses, and now his name is in my breakfast conversation. Another pause. That's not a misread, Grant. That's a liability. The call ended. He put his phone in his pocket and stood in the hallway and breathed. Down the corridor, in a quiet room with a round table and 3 chairs, Marcus was finishing a meeting with the founders of MedBridge Solutions, a health tech company building patient intake software for rural clinics. He'd spent the first 20 minutes asking about the problem before he asked about the product. He'd asked the founders where they'd grown up. He'd asked what had happened the first time they'd tried to raise capital. He'd listened to the whole answer. By the time he walked out, both founders were standing a little straighter. Grant's phone buzzed as he stepped back into the pitch rehearsal room. He looked down at the screen. A text from Diane. 4 words. 2 more pulled out. He set the phone face down on the table. The 90-day clock had been a pressure. Now it felt like something closing around his throat, slow and certain, and no amount of charm or back channels or proxies was going to move it. He had one option left, and he was going to have to ask for it. Ryan Shelby had not slept well in 3 days. He lay on top of the hotel bedspread at 11:15 on the third night of the summit, still in his work shirt, staring at the ceiling with his laptop open beside him. The resignation letter was still there in the document. He'd written it twice and left it unfinished twice. And each time he'd closed the lid, he told himself the same thing, that he had a mother in Durham with $22,000 in medical debt, that he'd been the first in his family to graduate college, that keeping his head down and his job was the responsible thing. He believed that. He also believed that the responsible thing and the right thing were, at this particular moment, not the same thing. He kept coming back to the man's face, not to the humiliation of it. He'd expected Grant to be dismissive, had watched him be dismissive 100 times in staff meetings and vendor calls, and anywhere else the power differential was clear enough. What he hadn't expected was the steadiness of the response. 3 seconds of eye contact, 1 nod. A walk away so controlled it made the room feel small by comparison. Ryan sat up. He touched the small gold cross at his collar. His mother had clasped it there the morning of his college graduation, told him it wasn't jewelry, it was a reminder. A reminder of what, exactly, she hadn't said. But he thought he understood it now. He pulled the laptop onto his knees and opened a new tab. He found the contact page for Tate Meridian Capital. There was a general inquiry addressed and, beneath it, the name of the executive assistant, Yolanda Price. He didn't write to the general address. He wrote to Yolanda. He told her his name and his title, and that he worked for Lakebridge Dynamics. He told her he had been present at the reception on the first night of the summit, and that he had witnessed what happened and had said nothing, and that he was writing now not on behalf of his employer, not to lobby for any meeting or any deal, but because he had spent 3 days failing to find a way to live with his own silence. He told her he would understand if she didn't pass the message along. He attached his resignation letter, unfinished, dated that evening, so she could see that what he was offering was not strategy. He read it back twice. He hit send before he could talk himself out of it. Then he set the laptop on the nightstand and turned off the light and lay in the dark with his hand flat on his chest, feeling his own heartbeat slow for the first time in 3 days. Across the hotel, in the lobby bar, a summit photographer caught an image that would circulate quietly the next morning among the attendees. Grant Hollister, alone, at a corner table at midnight, jacket off, phone raised, lips moving slightly, rehearsing something to a screen that offered no response. Nobody who saw the photo laughed. Yolanda Price had been awake since 5:30. She was in her apartment in Atlanta, burnt orange silk scarf already around her neck, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, laptop open and coffee poured, running through the morning's intake before Marcus's day started. She handled 40 to 60 messages on an average morning. She read every one of them. It was the only way to do the job right, she decided long ago, because Marcus had built something that depended on her judgment as much as her efficiency, and judgment required attention. She read Ryan Shelby's message twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked out the window at College Park in the early light and thought about it for a long moment. She had screened plenty of messages from people trying to reach Marcus through a side door. People who'd been turned down, people who wanted a second chance, people deploying every angle available to them. She knew what those looked like. They had a particular texture, urgent, self-serving, framed as concern for someone else, but pulling always toward the sender's need. This one was different. The unfinished resignation letter was the detail that told her. A man angling for advantage didn't attach evidence of his own vulnerability. She forwarded it to Marcus with a single line. "This one's real. Your call." Marcus read it at breakfast. He read the letter Ryan had attached. He set the phone down and looked out the restaurant window at the Charlotte morning, and he thought about his father. Earl Tate had told him once about a man at the trucking depot, a white driver who had watched a foreman speak to Earl in a way that no person should be spoken to, and who had looked at the ground the whole time and said nothing. Years later, that same man had come to Earl at a company picnic, a little drunk, a little desperate, and apologized. Earl had shaken his hand. Marcus had asked him why. Earl had said, "Because he came." It took him years, and it cost him something, and he came anyway. A man who comes when it costs him something, that's a different kind of man than one who looks at the ground. Marcus thought about that now. He thought about a 28-year-old kid from Durham, first in his family to graduate college, sitting in a hotel room at midnight, writing a letter that could cost him his job. He replied to Yolanda, "Note his name. I'll want to talk to him when the time is right." He put his phone in his pocket, picked up his coffee, and turned to the day ahead. He already knew what the day after tomorrow would require. He just needed one more night to let it take full shape. Day 4, the last morning. The summit organizer's message arrived in Grant Hollister's inbox at 7:42 a.m. He read it standing in the bathroom in his undershirt, one hand gripping the edge of the sink. Marcus Tate of Tate Meridian Capital had agreed to one meeting, not a private breakfast, not a quiet conversation in a side room. The closing keynote session. Main ballroom, full attendance. That afternoon at 2 o'clock. Grant read it 3 times. Diane was at the small desk when he came out. She looked at his face and didn't ask. He handed her his phone and watched her read the message. "He's not giving you a stage to apologize," she said quietly. "He's building one to stand on." "I don't have another option," Grant said. She looked at him for a long moment, the look of a woman who had seen every sign and chosen, every single time, to keep moving forward rather than examine what the signs meant. She had one more warning in her, and she spent it now. But Grant had already set the phone on the dresser and was looking at his suits in the open closet, deciding which one to wear to his last chance. He spent the morning preparing the way he always prepared, with the tools that had always worked. New suit, dark blue. Financial projections printed and bound in leather. Talking points rehearsed in the mirror until they sounded natural. The watch on his wrist, polished. He told himself the meeting was still winnable, that Marcus Tate was a businessman, and businessmen operated on interest, and Lakebridge's platform was genuinely strong, and once they were in the room together, he could make the case. He had always been able to make the case in the room. On the other side of the hotel, Marcus met Yolanda in the small conference room near the East Wing. She had taken the last flight out of Atlanta the night before. She set a manila folder on the table between them and left her hand on it for a moment before sliding it across. He opened it. He read it without speaking. When he closed it, he nodded once. "Good work," he said. Then he went to find Solène Harper. He found her in the hotel cafe, laptop open, sneakers scuffed white against the tile floor, natural hair pulled into a high puff. She looked up when he pulled out the chair across from her, and her hands went still on the keyboard, the first time he'd seen her hands go still. "I wanted to have a final conversation before this afternoon," he said. "I want you to be in the room." She nodded slowly. "Okay. Bring the Medbridge and Kudu founders with you." He stood. Front section, center. He left her sitting with her hands flat on the table and her eyes bright, not yet understanding everything, but understanding enough. 200 people would fill that ballroom in 3 hours. One of them would walk in thinking he was about to save his company. The other would walk in carrying a folder that told a different story entirely, and knowing exactly how it ended. 200 people filled the room. The same chandeliers, the same carpet, the same murmur of a crowd that had spent 4 days building the quiet consensus of who mattered and who didn't. The ballroom at the Charlotte Marriott Grand looked exactly the way it had on the first night, except that now, every person in it had heard the story. Every person had already decided how they felt about it. Grant Hollister sat in the front row with his financial projections in a leather binder on his lap and a tight smile on his face. He had told himself on the walk down that this was still salvageable, that Marcus Tate was a businessman, that businessmen, in the end, always came back to the numbers. The summit host introduced a special address from Marcus Tate, managing director of Tate Meridian Capital. Marcus walked to the podium carrying nothing but the worn leather portfolio. He set it on the surface beside the microphone and looked out at the room for a long moment before he spoke. He began with his father. He told them about Earl Tate, a long-haul trucker from Hamlet, North Carolina, who polished his shoes every Sunday night before the work week, not because trucking required it, but because he believed you kept yourself right for yourself, not for anyone else. He told them about the portfolio, how Earl gave it to him the day he closed his first deal, and how he'd carried it into every room since, not as a prop, but as a reminder of where he came from, and more importantly, of what he'd been taught to value. Then his voice shifted, not louder, just more precise. "I want to show you something," he said. The screen behind him lit up. The first document was a 2019 EEOC complaint, settled quietly by Lakebridge Dynamics under a non-disclosure agreement. A black software engineer who'd been passed over for promotion 4 consecutive times despite the highest performance scores on his team. The second document was from 2021. A Latino sales director, same pattern, same NDA. Both settled, neither publicized. Grant's smile had gone rigid. The third item was an internal email, forwarded to Marcus's team by a former Lakebridge employee who had reached out after hearing about the summit. In it, Grant mocked the accent of a vendor named Ramirez in terms that required no interpretation. The email was dated 14 months ago. Grant had sent it from his company account. Then the fourth item appeared on screen, a written statement, Ryan Shelby's name at the top. The room was so quiet you could hear the air system. Marcus looked up from the podium and found Grant's face in the front row. Grant had stopped touching his watch. He had stopped doing anything. "You didn't refuse to shake my hand," Marcus said, "because you doubted my portfolio." He paused. "You refused because you'd already decided what I was worth by looking at me. And the documents behind me tell us that you've been making that same decision about people for years." No one in the ballroom moved. "I will not be investing in Lakebridge Dynamics," Marcus said. He paused again, long enough for the whole room to lean in. "But I will be making an investment today." The pause lasted 4 seconds. Then Marcus said, "Tate Meridian Capital will invest $50 million, split among 3 companies I met with at this summit: Freightline, MedBridge Solutions, Kudu Capital." In the third row, Solene Harper's hand flew to her mouth. The founders of MedBridge sat very still for 1 full second, and then the younger of the two grabbed the other's arm and held on. The Kudu Capital founder, a quiet man who had barely spoken above a murmur all week, pressed both palms flat on his knees and stared at the floor with his eyes bright. The applause started at the back of the room and moved forward like a wave. Grant didn't hear most of it. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He looked down. Helen Marsh. He stared at her name on the screen while the room around him filled with sound, and he understood in a cold and total way that whatever came next was not going to be a conversation. He answered. He kept his voice low and his face still, the way you do when you're trying to keep a room from knowing what's happening to you. But his hand was trembling. The binder of financial projections slid off his lap and landed on the floor at his feet, and he didn't pick it up. Helen's voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. "You're done, Grant. Don't come to the office." The board had been watching the live stream. Helen told him a public statement would be issued by end of day. His access to company systems would be revoked within the hour. She was very clear. She was very brief. He stood up while she was still talking. His legs found the floor unevenly, as if the ground had changed its angle. He ended the call and pocketed his phone and began walking toward the back of the room. 200 people watched him go. Not one of them said a word. Not one of them met his eyes. The people who had laughed 4 days ago at a joke about caterers looked at the floor, or their phones, or the middle distance, anywhere but the silver-haired man in the good suit who had just walked out of his own life. Ryan Shelby stood near the back wall with his arms at his sides. He watched Grant pass within 6 feet of him. He felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. What he felt was quieter and heavier than that. A sober clarity, the kind that arrives after a long time of knowing something and finally being unable to unknow it. Grant pushed through the ballroom doors and was gone. At the front of the room, Marcus stepped down from the podium. Solenn Harper was already moving toward him, sneakers quiet on the carpet, eyes full. She extended her hand. Marcus took it. He shook it the way you shake a hand when you mean it, firmly, fully, looking at the person in front of you. The room saw it. Every person in that ballroom saw exactly what it was. The hand that had been refused, extended again, and this time, held. 2 weeks later, Atlanta was warm for March. The offices of Tate Meridian Capital occupied the 14th floor of a building in Midtown, and on a Tuesday morning, they were quieter than usual, deliberately so. Marcus had cleared his calendar. Yolanda had arranged 3 chairs around the small table by the window rather than the long conference table, because some conversations didn't need a long table. Ryan Shelby arrived 8 minutes early. He was wearing a new suit, still off the rack, but pressed with care, and his tie was knotted more evenly than it had been at the summit. The gold cross from his mother was visible just above his collar. He touched it once before Yolanda opened the door. She was wearing a burnt orange silk scarf and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she looked at Ryan the way a person looks at someone they've already decided to trust and are now confirming. She showed him to the chair by the window without ceremony. Marcus came in 2 minutes later with a mug of coffee and no portfolio. He sat across from Ryan and looked at him directly. "I read your statement," Marcus said. "All of it. Not just what you wrote about the reception." Ryan nodded. He'd written 6 pages. He'd expected Marcus to quote a line back to him, to acknowledge the useful parts. Instead, Marcus said, "You lost sleep over someone else's dignity. That's not common, and it's not small." Ryan looked down at his hands. His throat was tight. The role they discussed was called Associate Director of the Open Door Fund, a $20 million annual initiative that Tate Meridian was formally launching that week. It would back founders who had faced documented discrimination in accessing capital. Not just money, mentorship, legal support, and introductions to Tate Meridian's full network. The kind of infrastructure that turned a check into a door. Ryan was hired before he left the building. Yolanda Price was promoted to Chief of Staff that same afternoon, a title that finally matched what had been true for 14 years. Solenn Harper's freight line signed its first major client 2 days later, a regional distribution company that had been watching her pitch for 8 months and needed to see the Tate Meridian name before they felt safe saying yes. Medbridge hired 3 engineers. Kudu Capital moved into its first real office. That evening, Marcus sat at his desk after everyone had gone home. On the surface in front of him was a stack of applications, the first cohort submissions for the Open Door Fund's inaugural cycle. Dozens of them. Founders from Birmingham and Savannah and Memphis and Durham. Each one with a business plan, a vision, and somewhere inside the pages, a version of the same story. I walked into a room and they looked at me and decided before I opened my mouth. Marcus read the first one slowly, from the beginning. He had all the time in the world. 6 months after the Pinnacle Summit, Grant Hollister was renting a desk, not an office. A desk, in a co-working space on the 4th floor of a building in South End, Charlotte. The kind of place where 20-somethings in hoodies built apps and didn't know who he was. His name was on a whiteboard near the elevator, under the heading, New Members, written in someone else's handwriting, misspelled. He had not corrected it. He was trying to launch a consulting firm, Hollister Logistics Advisory. He had a website, a business card, and a list of 43 former contacts he'd been working through alphabetically for the past 3 weeks. That morning, he reached the F's. He dialed the first number, voicemail. He dialed the second. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He set the phone on the desk and looked at the wall. The Charlotte Observer had run a feature 6 weeks after the summit. 1,200 words, 3 sources, a photograph of the Marriott Grand's ballroom taken from the back of the room. The article didn't editorialize. It didn't need to. It simply told the story in sequence, and at the bottom, it carried a single quote from an anonymous summit attendee. We all saw it happen. Most of us laughed. That's the part I can't get past. That quote had traveled further than the article. Grant had seen it on LinkedIn, on Twitter, in an email from his brother-in-law that he hadn't answered. His wife had moved to her sister's house in Asheville 2 weeks after the summit, quietly, without a scene. She had taken the dog. She had not asked for anything. Hollister Logistics Advisory had 0 clients. He sat at the rented desk, in the borrowed chair, in a building where no one recognized his name, and he turned his Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. Once, twice, 3 times. Across the state, across the region, things were moving. 18 months after the Pinnacle Summit, Freightline had tripled its valuation to $60 million. So Lynn Harper's company now employed 31 people and operated across 4 southeastern states. MedBridge Solutions had signed partnership agreements with 3 hospital networks from Virginia to Georgia. Kudu Capital had expanded its fintech platform and was being cited in trade publications as one of the Southeast's most promising financial startups. The Tate Meridian Open Door Fund had backed 34 founders in its first year alone. Ryan Shelby had been profiled in a business journal, a full-page feature, his photograph above a headline that called him a rising voice in equitable venture capital. He'd sent a copy to his mother in Durham. She'd framed it. One Tuesday evening, Marcus was still at his desk at 7 o'clock when his phone rang. Yolanda. "There's something waiting for you in Hamlet," she said. "It can keep until Saturday, but you should go." He already knew he would. The drive into Hamlet took 2 hours. Marcus had the windows down, even in the cool of the morning, and he let the air change as the highway gave way to county roads. The particular smell of red clay and pine that he had carried in his memory for 30 years without ever quite being able to describe it to anyone who hadn't grown up inside it. He passed the neighborhood where he'd grown up, the houses smaller than memory made them, the oak at the end of the block still standing. He passed the diner on Route 74, where his mother had worked the lunch counter for 30 years, the same hand-lettered sign in the window, the same hours. He parked at the edge of the town cemetery and walked. He was carrying the leather portfolio, the same one. 30 years worn, its corners soft as old cloth, the leather darkened in the places where his hands had gripped it across thousands of meetings in hundreds of rooms. The object that had opened this story. He stopped at his father's grave and stood for a moment before he knelt. Earl Tate, beloved father. The dates carved into the stone. A small arrangement of flowers left there by someone. Marcus suspected the woman from church who had known his mother, who still came without being asked. He set the portfolio against the base of the headstone. Then he spoke quietly, the way you speak to someone you know is listening, even when you can't hear them answer back. He told his father about the fund, about the 34 founders it had backed in its first year, men and women from Birmingham and Raleigh and Memphis and Savannah, each one carrying a version of the same story, each one deserving a door that had been closed to them before Marcus opened it. He told him about Ryan, a young man from Durham who had known what it cost to stay silent and chose, in the end, not to pay that price twice. He told him about Solene Harper, compact and kinetic in her scuffed white sneakers, who had built something real from her apartment with thin margins and no safety net, and whose handshake in the ballroom had closed a circle that started the night Earl pressed this portfolio into Marcus's hands and said, "Character is currency, son. Don't ever let anyone spend yours for them." "Character talked, Dad," Marcus said. "Just like you said it would." The North Carolina wind moved through the cemetery oaks, slow and steady, the way it always had. He sat for a long time, and if you stayed with this story until now, you already know what it's really about. It isn't about one man losing his company or another man gaining vindication. It's about what Earl Tate understood from the cab of a long-haul truck in Hamlet, North Carolina. That dignity, once chosen, compounds. That the people who dismiss you often need you far more than you will ever need them. And that a life built on character will outlast every room that ever tried to make you feel small. If this story reminded you of that truth, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if it moved you, leave a comment below, because every story like this one starts with someone deciding it was worth telling. The portfolio leaned against the headstone in the morning light, worn and soft and full of everything that followed from one man's belief that it was worth carrying. It still is.